Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed the coffee break. We'll now start our second session. And I'll invite Mr. Jean-Michel Piedagnel, Director Southeast Asia of Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, to moderate this panel. Thank you.
Good morning again. So the next discussion will be about incentive for innovation and access to medicine. I will call again for Dr. Marco to join us, as well as Datin Dr. Sheamini from the Ministry of Health, and Krieger from TWF. So first thing I would like to say that the panel is, in terms of access to medicine, I think the panel is interesting because we have here essential component of drug development and access, which is, of course, we have Dr. Marco who's work on the development of drugs, but the development of drug is not just enough. You also need to be able to show the efficacy of the drug, and that's in Sheamini, that's definitely your area. But an area which is often underestimated, which Jocelyne will be able to speak about, is this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to have an IP, and especially a regulatory environment. So I think this panel is really interesting in terms of access. I will not spend too much time introducing you, Dr. Marco, because you have been introduced a few times already. But I think maybe your area of specialty is interesting in terms of what you do, your specialty in Fiocruz. So maybe if you could just explain a little bit.
Okay. I work in the Fiocruz Foundation since 1987, so it's almost 35 years. I started as a student, PhD student, and after this, I work as a research. My background is in molecular biology of tropical disease with Chagas disease at that time. But at the same time that I were working in the basic research field, we start to try to develop new tools for the control of Chagas disease in Brazil. So I start to work with technical development, and after this with production. So my background came from basic research to technical development, and also I was a director of one of the production facilities of the foundation. So I need to learn about GMP conditions, quality assurance, quality control. I think this background that allowed me to be in my position after 37 years to try to connect and I think this is the most difficult part. I will try to explain this during my talk. Trying to connect the basic research to the new products for us, and maybe for our countries that probably some of the products that we will need to develop by ourselves.
So, and I think it highlights the complexity of drug development. Something that when you are going to the pharmacy to buy your drugs, might not realize that this process is complex. It involves science, but it also involves a clinical trial, which is what. So I ask Dr. Marco to explain, because I cannot explain it, but I can explain your background.
Well, I thought I'll do it. I'll reverse it. I'll explain how I think it's easier. So you asked his experience. So I came out qualified as a public health physician. I was actually in the Ministry of Health, the Health Technology Assessment section. I was the national coordinator for the clinical practice guidelines, and ironically, we actually launched the dengue guidelines in 2009, and that's where I discovered on warning signs. And at that time, I was actually rather puzzled because we didn't have any evidence of warning signs, and I even contacted WHO to ask who's the authority, because this warning signs was actually put together by a consensus, a group of people. I then decided to shift gear and go into research because of dengue, actually. When I was actually formulating the guidelines, I realized we didn't have a lot of evidence, especially from Malaysia, which was very sad. And I then decided to go and be a clinical researcher. I actually wanted to head the clinical trials section at that time, but unfortunately, there was already someone there. For the last 14 years, I've been actually doing clinical epidemiology. A lot of things that are later I will probably describe is especially with COVID. COVID really shifted gears for the Ministry of Health, or especially the Institute of Clinical Research. I was actually evaluating vaccine effectiveness, and I remember coming across, because we had multiple platforms in Malaysia, and we were looking for studies. We were actually wondering whether our results was in keeping with other countries. And at that time, I remember reading about Fiocruz, Chile, and so forth. So this is a bit. I'm now the director of the Institute of Clinical Research. I am still learning. I'm actually really taking baby steps in clinical trials, but I will explain a bit of what we have done.
And finally, Yokling from the TWN. So Yokling is the director of TWN. You want to introduce yourself since everyone else is?
Right. Thanks, Jean-Michel. Well, I'm a lawyer by training at the University of Malaya. And when I was a student, intellectual property law was an optional elective course. And I ran for my life because I thought, well, it's all about corporations and it's so technical. And I was interested in human rights, environmental law, law and society. So I literally did not even consider intellectual property. But I spent the last 30 years of my life trying to learn intellectual property, understanding why, because really the wake-up moment was HIV. When we realized that we had the first time a potential drug, which was an old drug. It was really not something that was new. In a way, a repurposed drug. But it was so expensive, it was unaffordable. So I got involved when I was already with the O Network at that time in the Access campaign, which was launched by MSF and others. And Brazil was one of the first countries to say we can do a generic. Now, from India, it's simpler, I could say we can manufacture on a large scale. And that's the beginning of my journey. And then today I continue that. I really love working with the Ministry of Health and also our competition authority, which I will talk about a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, no need to say I know the three panelists very well. This is why I decided to go for a fairly informal presentation. Dr. Marco, you're going to talk now about the Brazilian policy for the health economic industrial complex and the mRNA vaccine hub.
It's quite complex, but let's try to do this. So, I have a presentation. I will try to go as fast as I can. I already give you an idea about our institution, so we'll be very fast. But just to highlight that we belong to the Brazilian Ministry of Health. As I told you, we started 125 years ago trying to help the Brazilian society and the Ministry of Health of Brazil and to face some of problems that we have at that time. Next. And we have a very complex ecosystem that cover different fields of the health complex in Brazil. Production, research, development, surveillance, information, education, healthcare. And I will try to show you the connection between these different areas in the Software Foundation and the support that our institute gives to the Ministry of Health, mainly in the policy of the national complex, industrial complex in health. Next. So just to give an idea, we have some problem with this slide, but research in red but should be there, but it's no problem at all. And then to highlight that research is really important for us. So at the same time that Oswaldo Cruz was fighting smallpox, yellow fever, and the plague, Carlos Chagas made the most complex discovery in the biomedical field. So he described a new disease, the vector of the disease, and the etiological agent of the disease. And this is the disease that we have in our country. So try to fill the gaps in terms of the knowledge of the health problems that we have is part of our DNA also. And just to give an idea, in 2016, Selena Tours, that worked in the Oswaldo Foundation, was the one that made the relation between the Zika infection and the microcephaly. So in the world, the Zika was more than 60 years, but she was able to see, and this is important because was a gap in terms of the understanding of this disease. So basic research is quite important for us. Next slide. But also production in the other side. So we started production with the serum for plague. The first vaccine was the yellow fever vaccine that we are doing the production there in 1930s with GMP condition for that time. This is final production. But just 1 year after we have the Zika outbreak, we have a big outbreak of yellow fever in Brazil. So we were able to grow our production for 25 million doses. We are the most important producer in the world for this vaccine, the yellow fever vaccine. But we, in 6 months, we scale up our production for 67 million doses. And in this sense, the Brazilian government was able to start a big campaign of vaccination in order to fight. So this is just to give you an idea that really we try to fill the gaps that our society needs. And in most of the case, the big pharma and the other companies will not have the product that we need for our society. Next slide. Just to try to show you how our ecosystem works using COVID as a model. So we work from the supporting diagnostic until the education of the public health workers in Brazil. So in a time that was really, really complex. Next slide, please. Just to give some of the ideas, we built an intensive care center in Rio, is not, and now is part of our National Institute of Infectious Disease. We started production of molecular tests for our public health system. The first demand of the Ministry of Health was about 2,000 tests in the end of January. And in the middle of February, they asked us to produce 1 million tests. So we were able to scale up our production, and we produced 25 million tests of the first generation, that was the RT-PCR test. And after this, more than 70 million tests, rapid tests, that was the next generation. But in addition to produce the tests, we also built some huge high throughput labs in order to perform the test. So almost 40% of the tests in Brazil was done inside of our Foundation, around 10 million tests. And also, we started production of the viral vector vaccine developed by Oxford and with the technical transfer agreement with AstraZeneca. And just to give an idea about the complexity of this scale, in terms of diagnosis, our capability was around 1 million tests per year. And in less than 2 months, we were able to produce 1 million tests per week. The same we should done with vaccines. So we produced inside the Oswaldo Foundation around 10 different vaccines, 110 million doses per year. And just for COVID, in the first year, we started technical transfer agreement, and we also produced 153 million doses. That was really important for the beginning of the vaccination program in Brazil. It was the worst time. Everybody said that Africa has a lot of problems, but in Latin America, we have just 8% of the population in the world and more than 30% of the deaths. So it was the worst place in the world. And we were able to control this in the middle of 2021 because of the vaccination. And it's important to highlight that 95% of the vaccine used at that time was produced in Brazil. So even if we receive and also use vaccines for other countries, in the beginning, for the first response, we as a big country, we need to have local production. Next one. So I will try to explain you about the policy that was developed also inside the Oswaldo Foundation. So was a PhD program that we have inside our National School of Public Health, that is the economic complex of health. And when the two professors of this program was in the Ministry of Health, the Minister Temporal and Carlos Gadeira, they decided to use this theoretical concept in order to make a national policy. And this picture shows what is the importance of this national policy. We have the Ministry of Health, NISA, trying to show that this policy is really important for us to guarantee the access of our population for the inputs that they need. But also we have here the Vice President, that is also the Minister of Industrial and Development in Brazil, trying to show that this policy is also important for the economic development of the country, and also the Minister of Science and Technology, trying to connect the improvement of health quality, development of science and technology, and to develop the pharmaceutical industry in Brazil. Why this? Next slide. Because health is almost 10% of our GDP. So this is the guideline of this policy. And the most important part is trying to show that but the most important part is that as we have a huge public health system, that is the big universal public health system in the world, the idea is to use the acquisition power of this big system in order to develop the industrial complex in Brazil. So try to reduce the technological weakness, promote stability for institution, regulation, and all the framework that we need for this policy. Next slide. And what is the role of Oswaldo Foundation in this policy? So this is the rank of the 20 biggest pharma companies in Brazil. Brazil is one of the top 10 big pharma markets in the world. And this is the last data that we have about this. And Oswaldo Foundation was the biggest pharma company in Brazil during 2022. This is really important. I would like to highlight also that in the 10 top pharma companies in Brazil, 5 belongs to Brazil and 2 are public. Oswaldo Foundation in first place, and also Instituto Butantan and the 7th position. Next slide. So we have a portfolio that is made by vaccines, more than 10 vaccines, more than 40 IVD, in vitro diagnostic products, and 10 biodrugs. This is the bioproduction part. The next one. We also, next one. We also have a small molecule production facility, and in this case, we work from the tropical disease to cancer and neurological disease. So a complex basket of products, and in this sense, we intend to support the most important programs of the Ministry of Health. Just to give an idea, 70% of the HIV drugs that are used in our national program are produced inside pharmacies that belong to Oswaldo Foundation. Next slide. So what we are trying to do is trying to connect this ecosystem, and I'm sorry that we have problems with that, but came from research into the production. So we are trying to connect this in order to improve the effectiveness of our ecosystem to develop. So the first one was to have a program, and we put in the same umbrella all the support that we give for our research. So it's a big project that we try to put in the same umbrella. Next slide. Also, the important part is trying to connect between research and production. We used to say that we have very good research, very good production, but most of the products that we have in our production is not developed inside of our Foundation. So we need to improve this, And one way that we are trying to do this is trying to have a systematic internal offer of the technology that were developed inside the Global Foundation. And we start this, we call this coffee with innovation. And we offer 140 different technologies that was developed inside the Global Foundation for our factors. And for our surprise, 103, almost 73% of this technology are now trying to develop products inside our factory. So this is really important because innovation in health is not the same as innovation in other fields. You need to have very good infrastructure, GMP conditions to produce the clinical batch, and also the knowledge of quality assurance and quality control. So what I'm telling here is that we are open to work together in order to develop a health product that is not the same as other kind of innovation that you can make, for instance, in your garage. As for we have a lot of that. Next slide. But even we are now working very hard to try to put this product in our production facilities. We have also some spin-off that start in the Global Foundation and now are spin-offs that are working together. For instance, the largest API manufacturer in Latin America was a spin-off of the Global Foundation inside Paranagues, now is the big company for API in Latin America. Also, we have the Slovakia project that started with the Foundation as a pilot project, but now we are building together with the WMP, the World Mosquito Program, a solution facility to try to expand this technology in Brazil. Another example. Next slide. So just to give you, forget to put the time. What I'm trying to talk in this end of my talk is that, okay, it's important to came from research to the production, but I think the technical development part using our production facility is really important for our innovation ecosystem. So next slide. Just to give an idea, the first product that we have for molecular tests was the max test for HIV, HCV at that time for our blood bank network in order to improve the quality of the blood for the Brazilian public health system. Took us almost 6 years to have this first product developed, but with the technology that we acquired with this development, in the last 3 years, we have 15 different products in the market. It's not patent, it's not paper, it's 15 different products that are using now in our public health system. Mainly, almost half of them came from the basic research in our institute. For instance, leprosy, Chagas disease, Malaya. So it was tests that was developed inside the Global Foundation now are really products in our public health system. I can stop now or I can go.
Yeah. But I think it was very interesting, you know, how I think you really touched on the complexity of drug development. In terms of the different aspects of drug development, not just the science, but also the quality, the whole ecosystem that is needed to develop drugs. So thank you very much. And another area we are now going to touch on is clinical trials. So, Datin Sheamini, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. First and foremost, I'd actually like to thank the Embassy of Brazil for giving us this opportunity to share our experience in conducting clinical research in the Ministry of Health, especially. Slide, please. So I thought I would actually, I know there are quite a number of Malaysians here, but I realized they are their excellencies, and we've just had our Deputy Minister, YB Dr. Nisman, just coming in. We are very small compared to Brazil. We only have a population of 3.27 million, of which 72% of them are actually in the urban areas. When we talk about healthcare systems, we have a very heavily led public health system. And we have a reasonable private healthcare system that is growing exponentially now. The largest healthcare provider amongst the public health care system is the Ministry of Health. And we are very fortunate actually, because in most environments, the researchers are actually in academia. But we have an unusual situation here in Malaysia where we are actually part of the Ministry of Health. And this is where evidence-based policy making takes place. Now, if I just share with you, this is the health facts produced for last year. 73% of the total hospital admissions actually occur in the public sector, and the rest is handled by the private. It's even worse for the outpatient system. About nearly 95% of the outpatients are actually seeking our public healthcare system. So this is a bit, and Malaysia is no different from Brazil. We have a double sword burden of disease. We do have both non-communicable disease and emerging infectious diseases happening to us. Next slide. So a bit about the institutes, and I think why we look at this one, you just returned from the National Institutes of Health. We have 6 research institutes there. The Institute of Medical Research, the director is also here, so we missed a very important session of where YB came and launched this morning. But I'm representing the Institute of Clinical Research. We've been established since 1998, and we drive mainly clinical research for the Ministry of Health. Next slide. Just for some understanding, so we're a bit peculiar, unlike the other institutes in the National Institute of Health. Besides being in Setia Alam, we have 37 hospital CRCs, and this is our greatest strength. We have the establishment of a network of research excellence, which spans right from the north, right to the south, and up to Sabah Sarawak. And it's all centralized. That means they all do report to the Institute of Clinical Research. And most of these centers at the hospital actually have their own smaller version of clinical research centers, which is actually led by mainly clinical specialists. And these specialists, next slide, please, could range from various disciplines. And for your understanding, in the northern area, we have people driving neurology research. Dr. Rosaida just explained, she actually was in Ampang before, and Ampang actually drives a lot of hematological research, and it goes on and on. So where the CRC heads are actually a certain clinical discipline, this is where the areas of clinical research that they will be leading. But before we go on, I think one of the things that I would like to emphasize is we were talking about doing procurement pooling. One apparent thing is, especially in the area of oncology, and we do know that drugs are very expensive, and we have a lot of patients, but we are unable to give them the best of care at the current moment. And for the information of our Brazilian colleagues, we have a universal healthcare system that we have been talking and wanting to reform. Next slide, please. So an overview of the existing research governance. We have all this in place. We have the registration. We have regulatory and ethical. We have a Malaysian Research Ethics Committee, which is centralized in the Ministry of Health. So you don't have to go to various ethics committees. It's actually placed in, they're situated in the NIH.
How long is the approval time?
Next slide. I've got the answer. But as far as regulatory is concerned, we have 3 acts currently regulating it. This is the Poisons Act, the Cosmetics Regulation, I think there's a word before that, and a Sales Act. And then, of course, we have the conduct of clinical trials. We do, as like in any other countries, we have the Clinical Research Malaysia to support industry-sponsored research. The Institute of Clinical Research, which was conducting a lot of industry-sponsored research, is now moving towards investigator-initiated research. Next slide. I'll get to your information. So we have a national platform where all studies who are conducted in the Ministry of Health are actually, it is available on our National Medical Register. It's indexed there. As I mentioned to you, we have a centralized ethics committee. Next slide. And we have various research documents, guidelines that we follow standards of the clinical practice guidelines, the GCPs. We have guidelines for inspection and registration. And finally, the National Institutes of Health itself has its own guideline for conducting research in health. Next slide. So this is the timeline. So once we receive these requests, especially if it's an industry-sponsored research, it will go straight to the ethics, but at the same time, it will be concurrently, the regulators will be looking at it. And the answer to your question, could you just press, please? It takes about under 2 months. We have actually moved this and reduced the timeline quite tremendously over the years. Next slide. So I'll be talking more about investigator-initiated research, sharing some examples. I was told that I only had 10 minutes, so I can't actually go into the details. But if you are planning to do investigator-initiated research, fortunately, Ministry of Health, I can proudly actually say we have now a clinical trial grant available since 2023. In the past, we didn't have this. If we want to conduct hybrid, that is where we get funding from outside. Then we have the mechanism to actually use the Clinical Research Malaysia to help us with the clinical trial agreement. And this has actually facilitated a lot of international collaborations or even collaborations locally. Next slide, please. You remember Dr. Rusaida talked about Ravideswe. I really have a problem pronouncing it. But I just want to walk you with it through it. She has explained about it. It's an initiative that DNI brought to to Malaysia and Thailand. Next slide. So this actually illustrates Malaysia's involvement in the Ravideswe journey. Apparently, the first 3 phases were conducted outside. But if you look at the lower part of this chart, you can see, as Dr. Rosaida mentioned just now, from 2016, the first pharmacokinetic study was actually conducted in our first in-human ward in Ampang. And I've actually, together with me, I have brought one of my experts in clinical trials, CK, who's here. Subsequently, after the pharmacokinetics was established, we managed to do the Storm C study. And then we went on to do the E study, which I will briefly explain a bit more in detail. Next slide. So Dr. Rosaida has already alluded earlier about the excellent results that came out in the Ravideswe study. Next slide. So we have an interesting situation here. I mean, I mentioned to you I have 37 hospitals, but this is one of the many opportunities. It's not the only, where the Institute of Clinical Research, because of the establishment of our hospitals, we are able to conduct such studies in the primary care setting. Because our clinical research center, in this case, is actually conducted in Alustar interestingly, the principal investigator is our current DG now at that time. And his clinical research center in Alustar was able to conduct the study in about, I think, 18 health clinics. And this was actually during the COVID time. And these health clinics are actually around the nation. So they were the project managers. They were the ones that actually looked at the issues. So our network doesn't even extend to the hospitals. Now we can actually go into the primary care, because to conduct clinical trials, you have the oversight, monitoring, and so forth. And it has to be centralized. Primary care centers, I think Isabel mentioned, she went and saw them, but there are 1,000 primary healthcare clinics. And you need to have people that are familiar with the conduct. And this is what CRC has, because in our 37 centers, we have a lot of exposure doing industry-sponsored research, and then we've now moved into investigator-initiated research. Next slide, please. So a bit of ICR's journey. We started off with the clinical trial registries, and I realized that we also have His Excellency from Spain here. We have a transplant registry that ICR actually established in very long ago. but the registries are no more with us now, as we have also grown. Then we had various initiatives, and then of course the Remdesivir Storm Sea Game study, and then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about experience in COVID. COVID, yes, it was, in the sense of for the researchers, it gave us a lot of opportunity. I know I shouldn't be saying this, but it made us to work together. And can we go on to the next slide? So during COVID, the Institute of Clinical Research managed, of course, the basic biomedical research. We did some modeling. We had 14 ongoing clinical trials, of which 10 were phase 3. We had investigator-initiated research, 3 of our own, and I'll share with you shortly. We had observational, we had epidemiological studies, and we even measured the vaccine effectiveness, as I was mentioning to you. We had, unfortunately, just like how you said, vaccine procurement was a major issue for Malaysia. We tried to purchase the mRNA, but the highest bidder. And so we ended up with a diverse platform. And as my center at that time was evaluating it, we weren't sure at national level whether our results were in keeping with other countries. We were involved in the solidarity drive, and so Fiocruz was there, and we had wonderful opportunities to work with even countries that we wouldn't have worked with, like China. I also need to mention that we have the only digital health and research innovation unit in the whole of NIH with the Institute of Clinical Research. So we have our hands in quite a number of things. Next slide, please. The experience for WHO solidarity trial was tremendous, unfortunately, and we were looking at repurposing antiviral drugs. It started giving us exposure about adaptive and platform trials. And this is unfortunately something that is lacking now. We need to build our capacity, especially for the Institute of Clinical Research in Malaysia per se. Next slide. This is one study I actually want to share with you. So we had a huge, of course, I'm sure you had this issue of whether ivermectin worked or not. In the thick of COVID, we said we have to come up with the evidence, because at that time, my director was actually chairing the COVID-19 vaccines initiative. So this IIR was actually conducted involving all our CRCs with no grant, but we leveraged on our networks. And we were able to actually publish in JAMA with involving 20 hospitals and 1 quarantine center, and with the sample size of 500. Next slide, please. And I know Jean-Michel talked about antibiotics. This is our recent initiative using the clinical trial cluster. This is looking at step-down care. In the case of MRSA, they usually get warded for 14 days. So this is looking at the opportunity of switching them to oral antibiotics. So this is my last slide. And what I would like to end off with is Malaysia offers a lot of opportunity. We are bigger than Singapore. But what we have is we have a multi-ethnic population. We have a naive population, and not a lot of our patients actually are not on any medications or so forth. We have 50% of our patients undiagnosed with diabetes. And we are English speaking, and we have this network in the Ministry of Health is a golden opportunity. So that's all from myself.
No, but as I work in the region for the NDI, I think you're right to highlight that Malaysia is now standing out, in terms of what it offers. It's offering clinical trial. It's really outstanding. The 2 months for regulatory approval is exceptional. Sometimes in other countries it's 2 years, and we have to remind ourselves of that. And I think the network is amazing. So I think it's really a big success for Malaysia. The next speaker, thank you. Next speaker is Joachim, addressing IP and regulatory requirements.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. Actually, we had a very good discussion on the regulatory issue this morning, and I'll pick up a little bit of biologics later. So I'll spend most of my 10 minutes on the intellectual property aspect. I think what is really exciting about the discussion so far, and also the real practical experiences of Fiocruz, is that the elements that we need for basic research, innovation, clinical trials, that is a complexity of technologies, research capability, infrastructure, legal, political will, and that's the complexity of the ecosystem of innovation to get us to the public health delivery. And in that ecosystem, in the last maybe 30 or 40 years, intellectual property has been always put up front, not by everybody, but certainly by big pharma. And unfortunately, many of the OECD countries, are now reflecting more the big pharma kind of voice, is to say, oh, we need, intellectual property like patents, stronger enforcement of patents and trade secrets to be able to drive innovation. And I don't think that that is a statement that we should accept as the truth, because it is not very evidence-based. In fact, the way the intellectual property, and I will focus on patents today, because it's the most significant for this industry and this area. What we see is that the balance between, rewarding innovation, incentivizing innovation through a temporary monopoly called a patent, is really the balance against that is that product, if it's of public health interest and pharmaceuticals certainly is, and diagnostics, then we must have that balance with public interest and public health. So it is a social contract. So it is the state that gives that temporary monopoly subject to conditions. So that was the balance. However, in the last 30 years, we've seen a very big shift in that balance, so that the system of intellectual property today, legally speaking, has become very unbalanced and very skewed. And some of the latest studies have come up actually from the US, for example, the Federal the Trade Commission, is that the way intellectual property is playing out in the US and because that's been globalized, is actually becoming anti-innovation. It's blocking research so that monopolies are being created and not really opening up research. And suddenly we saw, COVID really drove home the point. But even before COVID, we see with so many communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases, oncology has come up, that the concentration and reduction of manufacturing meant that we are very dependent on imports and we are at the mercy of excessive pricing. So I think what I want to focus on is that we need, with all this we have discussed so far, if we don't have policy and law in the area of regulation for drug safety and marketing, and if we don't have a proper sense of the kind of intellectual property system and regime that we need to have, then we will end up retarding R&D and cutting off access and affordability. So that's where we need to be. Now, until the what we call the TRIPS agreement today, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, this really came into being as a global standard for the first time in 1995. And now the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is administering that. Until then, it was really up to each country to decide whether or not certain categories of products should be given patents. And in most countries, pharmaceuticals were not included in that category. And for your information, Switzerland, today a giant of the pharmaceutical sector, home to that, they did not give patents for pharmaceutical chemicals until the late 1970s. Late 1970s. Why? Because the industry argued in the parliamentary hearings at the turn of the century that if the Swiss government was to follow the UK or the United States, it will kill any increase in innovation and the Swiss industry. That's what we are saying today, right? So you need to have, depending on your level of development of your industry, your innovation, you need to have a very sophisticated response in law and policy. But with the TRIPS agreement, there is now a globalized standards. Before you give patents for technology and processes, you don't need to give for products. Again, the TRIPS agreement made it compulsory that all technologies and all products, if you meet the criteria of the traditional, patent criteria, then you have to give it. So you have to show novelty in your product or technology. You have to show that it involved an inventive step in getting there, and of course that it has to be of industrial application. Now, these standards are up to national law. So that's why some products, some drugs, for example, like sofosbuvir, not patented in Egypt because it failed the test of inventive step. It is unfortunately patented in most countries. And so that's why some drugs are patented in some countries and not others. So the molecule itself is subject to that criteria. So the basic compound or molecule is your first patent. And under the TRIPS agreement, the minimum is 20 years from the day you file an application. 20 years is a long time. A long time. The next step that we need to tackle is there are many, many patents that are given, not on the basic molecule, but on small changes. And those small changes, if your law is not strict enough, will be allowed another 20 years. In Malaysia, one of the grappling constant battles we have is that we are giving such a broad range of what we call secondary patents, this type of patents. So for example, if you have a fixed dose combination of 2 or 3, that we give another 20 years. If you change it in form from injection to a tablet, we give another 20 years. Second of subsequent use of a basic molecule which already exists, we give another 20 years. So we have these secondary patents that extend the monopoly in the market beyond the first 20 years for the molecule. This is what we call evergreening patents. And it is a strategy of the originator companies to extend the dominance in the market. So in Brazil, you have, I think, some stricter guidelines. So some of the secondary patents we find in Malaysia, we may not find in Brazil. So this is an area I think we need cooperation in. Egypt is a very good country to look at. So is Argentina, because we review these criteria of what is novel, especially what is inventive step. The other area of cooperation I think is important is training of patent examiners. Because for a person to examine an application for a patent to be given is a combination of technical skill and it's an art. It's science as it is an art. You have to look at so many applications to look at the structure of the molecule, to understand that this is going too far, it's too broad. And if you don't have that knowledge and experience, you don't even know what you are actually doing. And the way the patent system is set up in terms of its identification, if you get an application, you may not even know that the application relates to a pharmaceutical drug. You do not know. It's not like in registration of drug processes where there is an INN. INN is the international, it's a domain name, yeah? So for example, Sofosbuvir is the generic name. So when you file, so I can go into a website of any of our regulatory authorities, you type in Sofosbuvir and it will come up, which are the brand names, which company has applied for registration. So the INN is your identifier. You go to a patent database, you type Sofosbuvir, it doesn't work. You need to know the molecule, the structure, and maybe with secondary patent applications, they'll say it's for the use to treat X, Y, Z, and you may be able to identify it. So if I were to ask my patent office, can you please give me a list of the patents related to this particular drug or that particular drug? They can't because they don't know. So this is a fundamental problem in the patent system, right? So there's a lot of reform in that area that needs to be done. So one is to tighten the law, and even the international agreement on TRIPS gives you areas where you can carve out. There are things that you do not need to give patents for. So most of our countries have not maximized what we call the flexibilities in actually crafting our national patent law. And then the standards of novelty, inventive step can be far, far improved. And then cooperation, and I think South-South cooperation is very important. Because if you look at the Patent Office of Egypt, they have very skilled examiners when it comes to pharmaceuticals. So some of us have been working with the Egyptian Patent Office. We actually have signed an MOU between the OWL Network and the Academy of Sciences so that we can do training of developing country patent officers. We recently did one in Cairo, where the Malaysian Patent Office also sent some officers to train there. We want to expand this program. I think it'd be very useful to have that kind of South-South in Brazil as well. The other thing that is very important to use, and most of us do not use it enough, is that the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is in Geneva, they have launched a procedure back in 2012, where, because it's a system, and Malaysia, Brazil, most countries have joined the treaty, another treaty called the Patent Cooperation Treaty. This has to do with setting up an international system. Now, there's no international patent. You have to go in the end country by country to get it. That's why national policy is so important. We still have that sovereignty. But there is an international system where a drug company, for example, can apply to the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WIPO system. You send in your application and all the countries which are parties, which is more than 120. So automatically all those countries are listed. So the preliminary examination is done by the WIPO system. And then they will give a preliminary assessment whether this is equitable or not. And that will then enter national phase for more detailed examination. So the WIPO system introduced a procedure for third-party observation more than 10 years ago, and it was not very much used. So when we discovered this in the whole network, we decided to do a pilot. So since 2018, every week there are publications of applications. So we got a small law firm that specializes in patent propositions in India, and we started screening. So from 2018 until the end of 2022-23, we filed about 200 third-party observations. And what do you do in this system is you actually look at inventive step. Is there already something that is out there, research, which if you can find that what we call prior art evidence, then you don't give the patent. Because, come on, research is not so genius that nobody else is doing it in most cases, right? So we have used that system and we're testing out. We did an analysis. It's actually published on our website, the summaries. And then once it goes to that system, all national patent offices, intellectual property offices have access to those observations that you sent in. And we found the patent office that is using our observations much more than anybody else currently is the European Patent Office. They found it quite useful because what we've done is actually submit more information than what the WIPO system is gathering. And so the whole idea is to improve the quality of your examination. So you think about, and in the United States, there's such a lot of applications in the sector and beyond that patent offices cannot cope, even the US. So in the generic industry, they challenge in the US a lot of these patents which are granted, and more than 50% that get challenged in the courts in the US get thrown out because they are not valid patents. So the quality of examination is very weak. Combination of reasons, not enough capacity in patent offices, including in the US. Just too much to go and do it. So you give and then you hope somebody will challenge. In the South, we don't have the capacity to challenge. It's expensive. So this is an area that's also for cooperation.
But I think your comment is not far from the one from Dr. Marco, but the complexity of drug development. So first, the science, the quality, all those aspects are very complex and do raise the question of collaboration, especially South-South collaboration, in order to address this complexity of science, of quality, but also, of course, of IP and regulatory. And I think I want to ask you a specific question, Joachim, about IP and regulatory, because there's very often a confusion between the two. In the mind of many people, IP and regulatory are one. So regulatory is in charge or responsible, or does regulatory authorities have to follow and implement IP?
Thanks. I think that's a very important question. I mean, these two systems are completely separate, right? Intellectual property is about private rights. So if somebody is given a patent, legal or otherwise, and some of these patents, remember, can be very weak or could be invalid, actually in challenge, right? So if I hold a patent, it's my private right. Of course, the state has given it to me. If a generic company is supposed to be, doing something, selling or manufacturing, they would do their due diligence. If I'm a generic company, I do not just go in and do a production. I will look at how many patents are around the product I'm interested in, et cetera, right? Or sometimes there may be one or two patents, but you do your due diligence as a generic company, you find it's very weak, all right? And frankly, if it's challenged, you probably will be thrown out. So I take the chance and I want to go to the market. So I take that risk. So this is purely private. If the patent holder, the originator company feels a generic is infringing its patent rights, then you go and sue in private law, right? Now, so this has nothing to do with the regulatory authority, because the regulatory authority is interested in quality, efficacy, safety. And that's for marketing approval. Completely different system. So a generic company, if the law is set properly, will know this patent is going to expire in 2025. So it gets ready. You go and prepare your dossier, you file for registration. so that on the day the expiry comes of the patent, I've got my product registered and I can take part in the tender, in the procurement tender. I can make arrangements with the manufacturer. I can have my supply chain assured, or I may want to manufacture, right? So that preparation process for registration is important so that we can get the generic or a biosimilar into the market as soon as possible. So what originator companies have been doing, and there's no international agreement anywhere that requires the registration office, the regulatory, authority to have anything to do with intellectual property. So what the originator companies have done is to lobby their governments, the UK, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Americans especially, do it through trade agreements. Have a chapter on intellectual property, and there you make the governments agree, southern governments, that your regulatory authority must make sure when the dossier is submitted for registration, that there are no patents hanging around on their product. So this attempt to make the regulatory authority a patent police is actually illegal. It's not required. So which is abusive. So we should not allow that. And if so, some regulatory authorities are worried. If I register a product and later on there's a patent, have I done something wrong? You're not liable. So nothing to do with regulatory role. And I think we need to keep that distinction very, very clear.
Again, adding to the complexity of drug development, drug registration, access to drug, and this is where collaboration is probably very useful. The kind of collaboration you are doing with Egypt at the moment. Dr. Marco, also in terms of innovation and access, it is a complex process, and maybe using the dengue alliance between Brazil, India, Thailand, Malaysia. Why is an alliance like this one useful in terms of access and the development of drugs practically?
Okay. First of all, I would like to say something about the intellectual property example that we have in Brazil, because we, in the beginning of this century, we are trying to discuss about the HIV treatment, and Brazil was one of the first that decided to say, okay, we need to treat everybody because we need to control the viral load in the population, not only in someone, with some criteria that they use at that time. And the big pharma companies say, no, it's too expensive to treat everybody. We need to treat just the ones that have this criteria, and then it will be a small part. And just to give an idea, at that time, Brazil has the same prevalence of South Africa in HIV. And then we decide, okay, we will treat everybody in Brazil that has a positive exam. For this, we need to work in a compulsory license of efavirenz at that time. Was the first one, but was a big issue for us. And the result is now Brazil has less than 1% of the population with HIV, and South Africa more than 13%. So we need to combine not only the economical aspect of the intellectual property, but the strategical points. And I think this, trying to think about public health, this is really important to put in the table in this kind of discussion. And I think now we are faced with the good development of technology. We have the possibility to treat disease that 10 years ago we are not able to treat, but the price is really $3 million, for instance, for advanced therapy for rare disease. That is impossible for any public system to supply. So we need again to try to find the best strategic approach to face this new I call a new emergency in public health, because the price of this new technology is really a big issue. And in this sense, I think the Dengue Alliance is really a very important initiative, because we are trying to connect the countries that have the problem, try to develop the solution. And this, I think, is the first time that we have this kind of alliance. We used to wait for the development of the treatment in the north to use in the south. And I think the Dengue Alliance is one really big opportunity to try to show that if we work together, we can try to solve our problem. And in this sense, I think it's really important to reinforce this initiative.
Before I take question from the public, let me know, Victor, when I don't have time anymore. I think also that Sheamini, in the experience you're highlighting, and again, it's I think interesting in kind of mobilizing initiative in the country. You know, I think of course COVID, but also to some extent the rapid SV, because it was developed in Thailand, Malaysia, kind of trigger in the country the realization that you have a potential, that you can drive more of the research yourself.
So, thank you, Jean-Michel. Let me just expand a bit about Remdesivir. And as I said, I've been hearing bits and pieces, and I'm now trying to put it together. And fortunately, I met Isabella the other day in the corridor and sat down with her. I think the journey of Remdesivir is you need to continue. And one of the things that I am observing is this disconnect, because there's this group of people here who know the history of Remdesivir, but we have a younger group of generation who might not know the history. And there's a lot more that needs to move on with Remdesivir. So this is where I feel that where the Institute of Clinical Research, especially some of our CRCs, like for instance, the CRC that's driving the PEACE project now, should start thinking of other areas that we could go down looking at Remdesivir. And the other thing I suddenly struck in me is we have actually started introducing Remdesivir in the hospitals and even the primary care clinics. Not always do we need to have clinical trials. We know people are now moving at real world evidence. If there's opportunity to do so, just like during the COVID-19 vaccines, that's what we did, looking at real world, because there were not enough clinical trials and we were rolling it out and we didn't know how it was working in the actual population. So we actually, when embarking in, especially investigative initiated research at national policy levels, this is where probably the alliance can work together and we can learn from each other. I would like to bring up something else. I know we keep talking about infectious disease, just like how she was talking about IP and regulatory. Another huge problem is in the area of cancer. And one of the initiatives that came to us is it's so expensive. In the Ministry of Health, most of our oncologists have actually enroll patients onto industry-sponsored research so that they can give access. But moving forward, that is during the period of clinical trial. What happens once the clinical trial is over? The other thing I wanted to elaborate a bit is we have this initiative that has come to our doors is looking at immunotherapy. It's very expensive. Big Pharma has actually a monopoly. Apparently, you can bring down the dose. And there are few clinical trials that are coming on board, mainly when we saw the publications was coming from India, but when I actually went for the WHO Clinical Trial Forum, I discovered that even developed countries are looking at this because it's just unaffordable. And how we can change a regulation, because I told you I have Mata's background, we would say we need to have a number of RCTs and then you go in the guideline. But in UK now, apparently just with one properly conducted RCT, NICE is willing to change its approach. So we're talking about affordable, accessible. I really would hope that it's not only the Alliance, but with the experience that the NDI has in Remdesivir, we can move such initiatives.
Thank you. Any questions from the public? Yes, go ahead. Please introduce yourself. And do we have a microphone? Oh, sorry.
Good afternoon, Excellencies and eminent panel. I'm Åsa Torkelsson from United Nations Reproductive Health Agency. On this International Women's Day, and I wish to congratulate all of us to that, I wanted to hear your general feedbacks on whether there are some gender-related dimensions in incentives for innovation in access to medicines. Thank you.
Maybe we take a few questions. Any other questions? No, so maybe you can speak about the forum.
So recently, it was just last week, I remember when I came into my position and Jean-Michel came up to me and said, we need to have a gender initiated forum. And in fact, it was going to call Women's Forum, I think.
Yeah.
But there was a bit of sensitivity on the use of the term women, although it's today. We don't want to go down that line. But so we use the word gender in neutrality. So we actually had a gender gender forum. I can't remember.
Gender, health and science.
Yeah, forum, which DNDI initiated with the National Institutes of Health and Mahidol University, where we spoke on different issues on gender. And I'd just like to move directly into the aspect of clinical trials and whether we have gender representativeness. And something that has just also been brought to my attention. I mean, do you know that we've only had, to my knowledge, 2 clinical trials in pregnant women? Everyone is so worried about including pregnant women or the women in the reproductive age group into clinical trials. So most of our clinical trials are in the male population. And then that is an issue because later, how does this trial, how does this medication or whatever work in a specific gender, especially in females? So WHO, after COVID, WHO just woke up and had this first clinical trial forum last year. And this was one of the major issues that women must be included in all clinical trials, and even pregnant women, they shouldn't be excluded. So this is one example that I can mention about gender exclusivity. Yeah.
And just to explain the gender of women, it's very interesting because there's also a lot of prejudice towards Malaysia as a Muslim countries where there's that feeling that women are not empowered. Actually, it's the opposite. Malaysian women came out as very empowered, and it's actually a neighboring country which felt that women in science felt like a feminist event and changed and asked it to be changed to gender, health and science. That's the background of that.
But maybe I can add, I think that that's why the work around cervical cancer is so important. Because neglected diseases is also neglected, on the basis of gender. So I think it's back to really the point we've been making. For too long, we've been responding to access availability of R&D and innovation done in the north. Because we have so many areas that need to be looked at, and we have to work on it ourselves. And I think that's why the South-South Coalition is absolutely so crucial. I just want to touch quickly on what I raised just now. I think oncology, the area of cancer treatment is going to be really, really big. I think it's so much more complex. I think we've been very lucky with HIV and hepatitis C because there is that, in a way, there is that silver bullet. We know they're very specific drugs. But when it comes to oncology, it's so different. And this is where on the regulatory part, the guidelines around biologics and biosimilars have been really very, contentious, right? So we were very glad that after many, many years of, all kinds of different, from some member states, civil society, even scientists, and obviously the biosimilar industry. So WHO has, recently modified its biosimilar guidelines, but it doesn't go far enough. So some of the full repeat of clinical trials, different phases, we don't really need to do all that. So just breaking that down, and we just had a very interesting workshop in January that we did together with the Ministry of Health. Really looking at our own, national guidelines have just been revised, but there are still many areas. So science-based regulation, evidence-based regulation is very, very important. So this is an area I think on biologics. More and more the drugs are in that category, especially for cancer. So we would like to see whether we put ourselves out cooperation around this area. And lastly, I think in the audience we have representatives from one of our government-linked companies, Pharma, and they actually made the decision some years ago to invest in an oncology production line. Now, most of our generic companies have been importing, and that's how everybody starts, even in the OECD countries. You're a generic, and then you build experience, and then you do the R&D in-house, right? And if you are public oriented public institution, I think Fiocruz is a really important model, because if we don't invest publicly to develop what we see in the Fiocruz, and you took me 100 and how many years? 135 years. Okay, so we don't want to wait 135 years. So you can teach us a shortcut, right?
155 years, a few meets like 500.
We believe we can do a shortcut. So now we can fast track and leapfrog from your experience, because that is really important. Because it's from R&D to the technology to the production. And Thailand has its own government production. In our country, we have government link, which is actually, they're not purely private profit oriented, but we need to support. And I'm glad the Deputy Minister is here, because, one of the, I think, mistakes that we have made in Malaysia, not this government's decision, the last government, is we went and ratified the trade agreement, the comprehensive and progressive. It's comprehensive, but I won't say it's progressive, Trans-Pacific agreement, whatever. So that has undermined our policy space. It has changed our rules and government procurement. All the things we need to do that made Fiocruz successful, we are now going to be constrained in this country, but it's never too late, because we are a sovereign country. Rules are just rules, so we need to think about, because if we don't have the supporting environment and policies for our domestic industry, then this is a very nice talk, but it won't happen.
So I think we come to the end of the session. Dr. Marco, you have a last reflection?
Yeah, just to highlight that local production is really important, but perhaps we don't need to think about country by country, but perhaps a regional production or something like South-South collaboration network. So this could be a way to solve part of the problem, and then, of course, we will be able to face the big issues that we are discussing here, mainly with rare disease and cancer. Now is really just to treat 70 patients in Brazil, we spend 1% of the budget of the public health system. It's the first drug. I think now we have more than 100 drugs that are almost in the end of the clinical trial. So this will be really a big problem, and we need to be prepared for this.
Thank you very much. I think we have